We're in the information age, but facts are in short supply. Reject the noise, ask bold questions, and pursue the truth with FBI whistleblowers and founding suspendables Garrett O'Boyle and Steve Friend. This is the American Radicals Podcast.
It is the American Radicals Podcast. On a Tuesday, we starting a brand new week here, folks, on rumble.com/mradpod. Make sure you give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if your heart compels you. Definitely give us a follow. Tell a friend or 12. We're trying to expand here on Rumble as we are on the iTunes and the Spotify and the iHeart, all those audio format of the podcast. You can look to us at X America News on YouTube, on Instagram, once Real Steve Friend figures that one out. We're trying to get everywhere, folks, trying to radicalize more Americans, and we appreciate your support. We appreciate you joining us today. Today is a brand new week. It's a brand new Tuesday, and we're going to be talking about the price of persecution. So we will touch and discuss the Los Angeles riots, fiery, mostly peaceful, part 2 today, and then as well as our own personal experiences associated with the civil unrest 5 years ago and the FBI's involvement and the boondoggle that is. Garrett and I both have our own perspectives on it. We'll also touch on the deep dive into a Minneapolis persecution that went on, and you'll see the theme throughout the day. There is a payout for so much as what has gone on with weaponized law enforcement and a justice system for some, not for others. But there's a case up in Minneapolis during civil unrest after St. George Floyd was killed, and individual there has now sued and been paid out because he was wronged by the police department there. We'll talk about the nihilistic violent extremism, the latest arrest. I told you, they're going to do it. They're going to make it the next big terrorism threat. And another example emerged last week. The FBI is partnering with the University of Michigan and private security to persecute protesters and bring criminal charges against them, and then search their houses to see if they can't dig up something else. And then we'll also want to highlight friend of the suspendables, actually suspendable herself, Amy Nelson, who got yet another blow from a weaponized government that is persecuting her and her family. So we'll get to all of that. We'll do some deep dives. It'll be a very enlightening experience for you all. And I can't do it without my friend, my co-host, Garrett O'Boyle at GOB Actuals, where you find him on the social media. How was your weekend?
Oh, it was just a string full of Mondays, Steve, as you know, the life of a suspendable. No, it was good. We had some nice family time. My father-in-law retired recently, so we went to a local super minor league baseball game called the Milkmen, and we had a gay old time.
I'm trying to get my kids to watch the Flintstones. They'll understand that we are allowed to say gay in this house because Trump's president now anyway. All right. Well, I had a fiery, mostly peaceful weekend myself.
Did you go to LA? Unexpected trip out west?
No, but it's hot in Florida, so it feels like fire. All right, let's talk about this Los Angeles stuff. I know everybody around the influencer space, the news space, social media is completely obsessed with it. We'll do a wave tops just for memorialization purposes. We know Rose will archive it away so that she can always tell followers on the Rumble channel that yes, the AMRAD pod did in fact cover down on the fall of Los Angeles before we had to send in Snake to save everyone. Movie reference out of the way. So LA riots. This is one from Daily Wire. Los Angeles surrounding areas have exploded in riots as anti-immigration enforcement demonstrators, many touting foreign flags, set fires and attacked federal officials. So last week on Friday, hundreds surrounded the Edward Roybal Federal Building in downtown LA. That's ICE described it as anti-ICE and said its agents were vastly outnumbered. They called for support from the LAPD, and it took over 2 hours for them to actually respond. So wasn't looking good going into the weekend. I know things definitely escalated. I was able to pull a couple of video clips of it. We'll give this first one to play. And this is what we're seeing out on the highways because apparently standing in traffic, which should probably be a self-defense law. Like I can just run you down and mow you over because I'm in fear of my life, because why are you stopping me on a highway other than you want to inflict severe bodily injury to me? But we'll give this one a play, and then we'll get your thoughts originally on the fiery, mostly peaceful Los Angeles riots.
Vantage point that we would not have without having helicopters there in the sky. Look at this, Austin.
Mexican flags?
Mexican flags. The line of law enforcement agents there during this face-off. It appears to be a face-off.
Yeah, and it's tough to tell sometime from a distance, but it looked to be the color of the sheriff's deputies that are creating that wall there.
So they're really concerned that there's a law enforcement response to the lawbreakers who are shutting down traffic in Los Angeles. And we'll get to some other examples of the media. Your takeaway, does it feel like we've been here before?
That's the biggest one for me. As soon as I started seeing clips of this takeover in Los Angeles, I immediately was brought back to the summer of love in, was it 2020 or 2021? 2021, right?
2020, summer of love.
There we go. And because, as those of you who've worked in government know, in every government building, for some reason, they have the news on the entire day. And so these types of images from Minneapolis, Atlanta, LA, Washington, D.C., just kind of on a loop. And I think we're going to have round 2 here starting in LA. And Steve, as you know, we will be the first to call out government wrongdoing, government overreach, government tyranny. But in this case, round them all up. Every single one. And I would have to do a little more digging on this. I just saw it on Twitter over the weekend, or I don't know, somebody mentioned the Insurrection Act. And so I read just a little bit of it. And here's the AI overview of what it says. The Insurrection Act is a U.S. law, primarily the Act of March 3rd, 1807, that authorizes the president to deploy the military to suppress rebellion, domestic violence, or to enforce laws in certain situations within the U.S. It essentially allows a president to override the Posse Comitatus Act, which generally prohibits the use of federal military personnel for civilian law enforcement. I say, Donald Trump, fire away. Let it rip with the Insurrection Act of 1807. Because that's the point that we're at. You've got people who are wantonly breaking all sorts of laws, destroying property, most certainly hurting people or putting them in potential harm's way. They're blocking traffic. They're rioting. Oh, and they're waving Mexican flags.
Well, waving flags of the country that they want to desperately leave to live here, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, we're bordering on talking about the hypocrisy, which is what the Republicans love to do. We'll steer away from there. You mentioned domestic violence. I mean, I hope it's not contrived to be like husband tunes up wife, so we deploy the Marines. But I mean, I don't know. I'd like to see 4 angry Marines show up at a spousal abuser's house. Here's an example of domestic violence, insurrection type of behavior, and also just really bad decision making when it comes to setting vehicles on fire. Let's have a laugh. Doesn't know how to open the hood.
Oh, I don't like the destruction of property there, but for the little bit of backblast that they got, hey, serves you right. I also wonder, is that gas can California compliant?
Oh, no, they are completely on green energy right now. Or at least they got to burn the corn for the ethanol purposes. So we're deploying the National Guard, and we're hearing some conflicting accounts coming particularly from the communists on the left. So number one, we're hearing a lot of representatives in government say that the National Guard wasn't deployed on January 6th, which Joe Hanneman's written a nice piece about in The Blaze. And I'm just looking over the horizon. We're going to have Joe Hanneman as a guest here on Thursday to talk about some of this other stuff. But no, they offered the National Guard 20,000 troops actually on January 6th, and it was turned down by Muriel Bowser and Nancy Pelosi. So that's just factually inaccurate. Those are just lies on their face. And then I'm also
Donald Trump led an insurrection.
I'm looking at the narrative, and I am going to see, and we'll touch on the fiery, mostly peaceful narrative that is being drilled. And we can laugh at it all we want, but they're going to drill this down as hard as they can so that when the National Guard comes out, they will be able to say it was peaceful until the troops arrived. And then they could just retroactively look back at the footage and say, oh no, what you saw last week, that's a deep fake, or that's a cheap fake. That's actually footage from right now. This is only happening at the National Guard is on scene. And this is the evil orange man bad, literally Hitler's fault for doing it. But let's just bring up the National Guard coming up out of the Daily Wire. They roll into Los Angeles, and from what I'm seeing at the time, I'm not sure if the Marines are being activated. I know that they are stationed close by. Maybe Secretary of Defense Hegseth will activate them in some regard, or at least get them ready. U.S. Northern Command confirmed that members of the 79th Infantry Brigade combat team arrived in L.A. More troops expected to arrive. Trump ordered 2,000 to the Los Angeles area to quell unrest, and 2,000 versus 20,000 at the Capitol. So only a tenth that were authorized for anybody concerned about there being too great of a military presence, and decrying the fact that there wasn't one at the Capitol. I mean, seems like he's actually cutting you short there, LA.
Yeah, as you guys know, I'm an old army dog, an infantry guy in the Army, and I would be the first to say, if you want this rioting to end, you want this mayhem, this chaos to come to an end, activate a few battalions of Marine Corps infantry from Camp Pendleton, give them clear and reasonable rules of engagement, and it'll be over by the end of the week. But we won't see that. And quite frankly, I think we should. What did you say? 2/10 or 1/5 of the National Guard was activated? Is that
so 2,000 are being sent to LA.
Okay.
20,000 were authorized to be deployed at the Capitol on J6. So yeah, 1/10.
1/10. And I mean, send them all. If you got 20,000, you got approval for 20,000, send them all, and put a stop to this. And while you're at it, empty out the warehouse that has all the flex cuffs and give them to the guys, and arrest every person. And on top of it, enact a curfew, and just start taking people into custody. And then you'd have to charge them, which then it's going to blow back in their face, because is the Los Angeles County or the city of Los Angeles, are they going to pursue charges against these people? Probably not. But then you got to the extent possible, pursue federal charges.
Oh, you have your governor right now in California saying, "Oh, come at me, Tom Homan. You know where I'm at. You can put me in jail," because they have lots of good hair products in jail. I'm sure I'll be looking just like American Psycho. Let's do a couple of video clips about the narrative casting that we're seeing. I think this one was put out by Homeland Security as a dunk on Karen Bass, the mayor of Los Angeles.
Outraged that this has happened. Of course, what happened here, I think, was probably the worst. There were a number of locations where ICE raided today. And, to me, when these things happen, it sows a sense of terror in the community. It's bad enough that it happened at this location, but the way this goes and spreads throughout the community, then people are not sure where they're.
So it's definitely ICE's fault that the people then rioted, but they're not rioting because they're fiery, mostly peaceful part 2. And let's hear from the reporter at ABC.
Demonstrations have been going on right outside the Federal Detention Center. Most of those demonstrators were very peaceful. They were chanting, they were shouting. People were driving by, honking their horns. And again, they were expressing their anger about the detention of so many immigrants.
Oh, that's why they're totally doing
the immigrants, Steve, which the language, as we often say, matters. She calls them immigrants. So she's inferring that they came here legally. That's not the case. That's not true. That's not what's happening. It's illegal aliens who have come here with the intent right off the bat to break our laws, who are getting arrested and deported. And now you have a whole slew. And I'm sure there's illegal immigrants involved in this rioting. Certainly there's citizens involved too. But does any of that tell you that they're afraid of ICE? No, they want to stage a violent takeover and rid themselves of any type of law enforcement.
Mhm. Now, two things I want to spring out of this one. Number one is the California fires that we had at the beginning of this year. We have an adjoining piece that's unrelated to this at all, but it's about LA. And it says the state asked Congress for $40 billion to help Los Angeles recover from the fires. I think that there should be a price of the persecution that they've inflicted on their people there. And if you live in California, get out. It's ceded territory at this point. If I'm the Trump administration, I would just flat out say, or if I'm Congress who's been asked, I would say, I can't determine if it's the wildfires that you caused to happen because you didn't pump water where it needed to go, or the riots that you encouraged to happen. So you get nothing from us.
Right. And that's the type of bold measure that I think must be taken at this point. California has demonstrated time and time and time again that they have no interest in basically being a cohesive member of our union. So you don't get any federal funds anymore then. And if you live there and if you voted for these people, you made your bed and now it's time to take a rest in it. And nobody else across the country should have to spend even a dime, even a penny to try to get you out of the mess that you've created. You've done this to yourselves.
This yourselves because you elected people like Kamala Harris, or at least tried to elect her president. This is a statement from Kamala D. Harris. Los Angeles is my home, and like so many Americans, I am appalled at what we are witnessing on the streets of our city. Ooh, she sounds a little bit like a Republican there. Deploying the National Guard is a dangerous escalation meant to provoke chaos. So there you go.
Okay. It's not the National Guard who's escalating anything, Kamala.
No, the National Guard arrived and there was nothing happening. And then we just randomly sent 2,000 National Guardsmen and then riots sprung up out of nowhere.
Right. Speaking of Kamala, do you think the McDonald's that she claimed to work at is in LA, or do you think it's somewhere else? Because she's just lying through her teeth again. Apparently, these people don't learn that the incessant lies end up not working for you because just enough people realize that you're a piece of garbage and they don't buy it into your myth.
I think some people will buy into the myth of competence from our ex-girlfriend at the FBI, which is the second thing I wanted to bring it to and tie it to Operation Legend, which you and I had the experience with in 2020 during the Summer of Love. And then we were surging resources to these various cities that were high crime. Chicago was one, and St. Louis was another. There were a few. There's a list of them. And I'll connect it to this Los Angeles story because you and I have heard from the inside that they are now canvassing within the FBI to deploy people immediately to Los Angeles to help with the civil unrest. They're going to ask for people to volunteer, people who by and large are indoor dogs, and in their defense have never been trained on crowd control or riot control, don't have the tools to actually engage in that, but they're going to do the same thing that the FBI always loves to do, and that is see a headline and immediately send manpower at it like it's a scene from World War Z, and we're going to send hundreds and thousands of resources so we can say, look what we brought to bear here. We immediately activated Congress, give us billions and billions of more dollars, but it's not going to fix the problem. It's actually going to put people who are not equipped to address this problem. And it's also going to distract them from doing what actually is in their lane, and that is probably developing a case and investigating how the organization went behind this, because it does not seem organic. It looks like it's completely organized and funded by nefarious actors, but they're not going to do that. That'll distract the people on cable news and on social media because they'll see some kitted up agents who will be selectively pictured and photographed in ways that make them look really cool and intimidating. And then we can be so back, baby. America's back. We're based now. We don't need the FBI to actually do an investigation. Now, all of that said, Operation Legend is my proof of concept for this. Now, my experience, I didn't get deployed. I wasn't raising a hand to go to Chicago, but we're talking about 2020 when there were coronavirus mechanisms or measures in place. And there were agents sent from my division in the FBI Omaha office to Chicago, where they had to quarantine for 2 weeks. And then, because it was a 30-day temporary assignment, they spent the next 2 weeks in the office. But because of the restrictions on manpower, everybody in the Chicago office went home. And then they had a whole bunch of agents who were there who didn't know how Chicago worked. sitting in the office, meanwhile collecting hotel points and per diem the entire time. That's generally the way that Operation Legend and what will go on in Los Angeles functioned. Or at the very least, they'll take person that is going from Houston or Memphis to go and help in LA, and they'll partner them up with an LA agent. So you will have the maneuverability of one agent not actually doing a forced multiplication. They won't be doing any extra work. They'll just be kind of like tied to the hip as a buddy. But I'm open to being convinced. What was your experience with Operation Legend?
Oh, it was similar, and I heard similar takes like that. People who end up getting quarantined and not knowing the city, they're just there on per diem. It ends up being just kind of like a fun work trip to Denver or wherever they went for a few weeks, and away from their home base, and not really helping further the mission at all. My limited experience was in Kansas City. I was brand new to the SWAT team, and I headed up from Wichita for I think like 2 days because we had to do some route running because the Attorney General, it was AG Barr at the time, was coming into town because Operation Legend, a big piece of it was this little kid who got killed in Kansas City from gang violence, essentially, is what it boils down to. And so there was like a big push in Kansas City during that time as well. But we were really just plussing up the security detail for the Attorney General while he was in town. So, but along these lines with LA and sending the FBI, I have a hard time not thinking of the Simpsons meme of the kid on the bus who's like picking his nose and says, "I'm helping." And that's what this is. In the Army, we call them Spotlight Rangers. That appears to be what the FBI is doing here. Like, oh, we got to try to grab some of the headline here. We're going to go help. And you continue to hear things like, this is what happens when you let good cops be cops. Well, guess what? FBI agents are not cops. FBI agents are investigators. Yes, they're law enforcement. Yes, they have arrest powers. But to go join the LAPD with a riot shield is not part of the FBI's repertoire. You mentioned working an investigation, doing a complex investigation. That's how they could help here, is if you get a handful of seasoned investigators to determine, okay, who ordered the pallets of bricks that are being delivered to these streets in Los Angeles? Who is funding aspects of this? Who paid for those bricks? Who was the delivery company that dropped them off? And actually start doing your job, your piece of the puzzle to help bring this to an end, to help put bad guys in handcuffs and then behind bars. But you joining the frontline LAPD riot police isn't going to do that because FBI agents don't know what they're doing in that regard.
Never done crowd control. I mean, I did it as a police officer, training specifically. Well, we didn't get that at the FBI Academy, and certainly weren't equipped with riot shields or batons or anything to that effect. So you're going to be a subtraction by addition, if I had to break it down, because you'll be a liability. Not to mention the fact that so many of those people have never engaged in any sort of kinetic action outside of the academy context that they will go code black and need to be rescued by the LAPD. Pivoting away from the riots, let's do a quick palate cleanse of LA before we get to the meat of the show here. And we'll do a palate cleanse of LA by covering another story out of LA. And you mentioned Kamala Harris knowing whether or not the McDonald's is still functional. Probably not, because they just passed a $30 minimum wage. And if you do fries in California, $30 seems a little bit steep. It's going to put those franchises out of business. But just quickly, it's a $30 minimum wage that's supposed to be for hotel and airport workers by 2028. It requires not only a $30 minimum wage, but $8.35 per hour extra for benefits. So it's close to a $40 an hour minimum wage. And there's been a study done, an economic study, that the mandate that found that it's 15,000 hospitality and construction jobs are going to be eliminated. $342 million in construction spending is going to be halted. $170 million in tax revenue is going to be lost. That is the price of persecution. Oh, yeah. And they're going to be at risk of losing the Olympics now, because there are certain contracts that you have to have a certain number of hotels available for people who are coming to watch, and athletes and workers and all that. And a lot of hotels are like, we can't operate. So we're just going to shut down. And now they could possibly lose the Olympics, which is basically a stimulus program for whatever city gets it. So they'll lose out on those billions too. Enjoy cleaning up after the fiery, mostly peaceful riots that I'm going to argue were completely from the wildfires.
I know for a fact that we have some California residents who listen regularly, and they're more of a like mind to us. I want to talk to people from California who voted for Gavin Newsom, because this is what you voted for. So good luck paying unskilled laborers essentially $38.25 an hour. Again, you made your bed. Time to sleep in it with the riots and everything going on in the background, because this is unsustainable, plain and simple.
Okay, let's talk about we'll talk about 2020 and the civil unrest that was all across the country, but particularly it stemmed out of Minneapolis. And I found this story about a gentleman who was a victim of police brutality, for any lack of any other term, and the depths that this went to, and you contrast it with the fact that we had multiple nationwide funerals for a fentanyl addict that one time pointed a gun at a pregnant female, and statues built in his honor where he's drinking a 40, wearing a wife beater, sitting on a bench, St. George Floyd. Contrast that with like a Jaleel Stallings, who I don't think you or I get along with politically very much, but certainly didn't deserve what happened to him. So this was the story that came across my radar. And this comes from the Marshall Project, which is not a right-wing source. They are all in for the BLM. And I'm sure they're very excited with the peaceful riots that are going on now in Los Angeles. But they still did a decent job of covering this story entitled "The Minneapolis Cop Who Beat Him Pleaded Guilty. He Still Fears That Apartment Won't Change." Now, the fifth night of protests in Minneapolis following George Floyd's murder, which I guess we technically have to say because he was convicted. This is Jaleel Stallings. He and a group of friends, they set out to join the crowds, and as they had on prior days. They were part of the mostly peaceful as it's represented here. I don't know if Jaleel Stallings was doing anything violent, but judging by the fact that he's a concealed carry guy, probably not. That tends to be like people that are just really like their constitutional rights. A stranger came running down the street screaming, quote, "They're shooting." Stallings' adrenaline started to pump. He took cover for a moment and then noticed a white van approaching him. He worried it could be armed white supremacists. Now that sounds a little bit ridiculous.
Yeah.
But, and this is again, the price of persecution. You can persecute people mentally, emotionally, by telling them things that are going to make them scared. And 5 days after George Floyd died, people across the political spectrum were saying like, oh, it looked like he got murdered pretty much in cold blood. Like a lot of the details had not emerged yet.
Yep.
Well, why would Jaleel Stallings believe that a white van was going to have white supremacists that were shooting at him? Well, because Minnesota Governor Tim Awals had warned that the situation in Minneapolis was volatile and outsiders, specifically white supremacists, were flocking to the area to revel in the disorder.
Well, how about that? Your god of government is the one who instilled this fear. Because on its face, I was like, that seems like an unreasonable fear.
Seems a little bit strange, right? That's a boogeyman. But, you try to put yourself back 5 years, 5 days after the incident, you could maybe come around to understanding what his perspective was. Now, I mentioned that Stallings is a concealed carry guy because he grew up as a shooter, as a hunter, actually 4 years in the Army. So he always carried concealed. So as the van crept by, again, this is from the Marshall Project, he drew his gun out and it was pointed down, low ready, and this was captured on surveillance camera. So this is not just his telling. Stallings says he heard a bang and felt a searing pain in his chest. He believed he'd been struck with live ammunition and he fired 3 shots. No one was hit. He retreated to the back of his truck and the volley lasted 2 seconds. Stallings did not realize is that the van was carrying members of the Minneapolis police SWAT team and that he'd been struck with a marking round, which is a 40 millimeter projectile coated with paint. So he took it to the chest, and I think reasonably so thinks I'm shot because that would that would render you that pain, and you would assume adrenaline kicked in, and I don't feel the 7.62 round or whatever that just went
Mhm.
through me.
Yeah, totally. I mean, with as this picture continues to get painted, that now to me seems like an entirely reasonable response,
Mhm.
especially for a guy who is familiar with guns. He's exercising his Second Amendment right to carry, and then his army training. I don't know what his MOS was, but battle drill one is react to contact, and that's exactly what he did. He hears a bang, he feels immense pain, guarantee you. Because when I was a cop, we had these 40 millimeter less lethal. The thing looks like a grenade launcher, but
Uh,
it's less lethal. And in the training for that, and they include pictures of of bruises and markings that it causes. And so if you're getting hit in the chest with that, completely reasonable to think I was just shot.
Mhm.
And now you see this white van that's slowly passing by. You hear, he's putting all these things together in real time. Sounds like a reasonable response to me because you're getting shot at. You don't know that it's less lethal. And so you shoot back because you have a reasonable fear for your life and perhaps anybody else who he was with, family, friends, who knows. And so he responds as somebody should, because he has an imminent fear, a reasonable imminent fear of life, limb, or some type of serious bodily injury. But it was from the police.
For context, there was an individual who was shot point blank range with one of these 40 millimeters at January 6th and split his femur vertically all the way down. Like that's the impact that it can have. He was like on his butt for over a year. He's suing, but of course it's in Washington D.C., so he'll probably never get anything. As an aside for this particular story with Stallings, and this is reported from the Marshall Project, they actually got video from the police body cameras, and this particular Sergeant Andrew Battel's body camera recorded him telling his team, quote, "We're rolling down Lake Street, and the first effers we see, we're hammering them with 40s. They're just going to fire indiscriminately at people." The footage also showed officers repeatedly shooting at people from the van with no warning and commanding people to go home only after shooting the 40s at them. All right. So we're back to Jaleel Stallings, takes this round to the chest, fires 2 seconds, and then he realizes that the van is law enforcement without them saying anything. And he realizes he'd been struck with his marking round, and then he goes immediately down. He hears them say shots fired. He lays on his stomach and basically allows them to arrest him. Okay, so no resistance at all. Drop the gun, lays face down, arms over his head. So at that point, one of the Minneapolis police officers who was part of the SWAT team, his name is Justin Stetson, he ran out of the van, reached Jaleel Stallings, launched more than a dozen punches, kicks, and knees into his face. Surveillance video shows he wound up fracturing his orbital socket. In the audio from this officer Stetson's body camera, Stallings can be heard pleading as the officer rains down more blows. The Sergeant Battel, who said, "Hey, we're going to light these guys up with 40s," tells this officer Stetson, "That's it, stop," and briefly holds him back, and they wind up taking him into custody. So in 2021, now, this is not over. He's charged with attempted murder, armed riot,
Dude.
and some other lesser charges. A year goes by. He was not in detention the entire time. I think he had a few days that he was locked up. He was able to get bonded out. Probably doesn't have a career criminal record. Probably by the fact that he also was a military guy, you would think that probably was boded well in his favor in the circumstances of it. So a year goes by, 2021. He rejects a plea deal that would have sent him to prison for a decade.
Ooh, good for him. I mean, that's a hard decision to make when you got the weight of the government on you and now charging you with attempted murder of a police officer.
He testifies on his own behalf. He is his only witness at the trial. Okay, this is the defense he mounts. Subsequently, he gets acquitted. The prosecutor, a year after this trial, was like, "Yeah, it was probably wrong of us to bring these charges."
Yeah,
in
you think?
retrospect, right?
Gosh.
The former police officer, he's now former, who assaulted him and winds up breaking his orbital socket, was criminally charged.
Okay.
and pled guilty to assault and was sentenced to 15 days in a county workhouse, 2 years of probation, and a $3,000 fine. The price of persecution. Now, he paid a price. Julius Stallings is, never going to look at police one way or another. I mean, he was probably pretty suspect of him if he was at a George Floyd riot, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's bringing that back from the brink at any point in the future. And then he went the stress of over a year facing a attempted murder trial. And then now the taxpayers in Minneapolis, they're on the hook because he sued and won $1.5 million. Enjoy paying that out, Minneapolis.
Mm-hmm. Honestly, I think he should have been awarded more. I think that's low considering the circumstances. And I'm sure the government argued, well, you got to understand
immunity.
Yeah, our qualified immunity, our police officers were under immense stress. Yeah, that goes with the territory. That doesn't mean you get to make an egregious error like this. And then when the guy gives up, you get to break his orbital socket because he realized that you were the cops and you weren't adequately announcing. You just started shooting these 40 millimeter rounds at people. And now he has to go through this continued persecution to try to clear his name. I'm sure his orbital socket's never going to be the same, even though it healed. There's lasting effects to that. And again, I'll still say the story we were sold about George Floyd was a lie. Go watch The Fall of Minneapolis. I know whenever we talk about this topic, I plug it because it is that imperative to understanding what truly happened that day. But that does not mean that actual police misconduct, like we see in this case, is okay. It certainly is not.
Well, Garrett, that's Minneapolis's problem. That's Minnesota's problem, land of 1,000 genders. We certainly have never seen anything like that, like from a federal standpoint, where you and me and the American Radicals podcast could be on the hook financially for the price of our government's persecution, except the BBC is now reporting that Proud Boys are suing the U.S. government for $100 million. Remember, the U.S. government can just print $100 million, by the way. So
where's Dr. Evil when you need him? $100 million.
5 leaders, and this is the BBC, of the far-right group, the Proud Boys, who were convicted in connection with the January 6th Capitol riot, no editorializing whatsoever, have sued the U.S. government for $100 million. The lawsuit was filed in Florida, so they stand a pretty good chance if they're filing in Florida. That's smart. It claims that the FBI agents and prosecutors were motivated by personal biases when prosecuting the case. The lawsuit filed alleges that the 5 leaders of the Proud Boys were subject to egregious and systemic abuse of the legal system. It accuses prosecutors of engaging in instances of evidence tampering and witness intimidation. I think it'll be interesting because they're going to have to go through a discovery, and that will have some names on there. So maybe there will be some sort of accountability here. I know that the allegation will be, well, this statute of limitations and qualified immunity. This is still going on. The statute is not up. These people have advanced their careers. They profited from it. I would argue energetically that this is furtherance of the conspiracy that they're engaged in, because we heard, both of us independently, that January 6th was our 9/11. And they weren't saying that as if it was an attack on the country and we all need to rally around the flag. They were saying, this is our time to get our hooks into this case to advance our careers forever.
Yep. Get yourself a good J6 caper, and then you can punch your ticket because you'll be putting it in your FD 954 from until the end of your career, because J6 is such a big deal and the biggest investigation the FBI has ever done, bigger than 9/11, and it was all built on sand. It was all a sham, a lie. Yes, we've said before there are people who acted poorly that day, to the point where there were righteous arrests, but the government misconduct was so egregious that Donald Trump truly had no other option but to pardon every person because of how bad the government was, which included the FBI. This is the Proud Boys we're talking about here. $100 million lawsuit. Their leader, or one of their leaders, Enrique Tarrio, had the biggest sentence out of any J6er, even though he wasn't even there. He was in a hotel room in Maryland, if I remember correctly. And then he got 22 years or something like that. and he got pardoned like the rest. But as we have been saying lately, the law, the government is not supposed to use the law as a sword. They're supposed to use it as a shield to protect innocent people and to go after evildoers, not to use it as a sword to go after your enemies because you disagree with what they did, what they believe, how they think, who they worship, or anything like that.
I don't even know if these top 5 Proud Boy guys got pardons. They might have just had the sentences commuted. I know Joe Biggs, I had a conversation with him, and might be an update to it. He had just had a commuted sentence, which means that he wasn't entitled to even get his VA benefits as a result of it. So you're still dealing with that. And they're suing for $100 million, which we'll all be on the hook for. And I don't know what the amount that will be paid out or if anything will, but there is a price attached to that. And there's a parallel one to that one, which actually has been resolved. And that's Ashley Babbitt. Ashley Babbitt's family has come to a settlement with the U.S. government for a multi-million-dollar amount, which is just under $5 million for a wrongful death lawsuit. And here's some background on this case, because I know she's a very well-known name. You and I have a friendship with Joe Hanneman, who's just been all over it. But I think a lot of people are unaware of certain facts of this case, like when Michael Byrd shot her, not in compliance with any use of force policy that I've ever seen in law enforcement, where you're supposed to have a reasonable belief of imminent threat of serious injury or death to you or to another person. An unarmed woman walking through or crawling through a window does not present that threat. Then he left there and went into a different room and got on the radio and said that he and his colleagues were taking fire and they were preparing to return fire. So he spun up all of the response into an active shooter response, which completely changes the way law enforcement responds to a scene. Because if any situation, you're supposed to de-escalate, officer safety is paramount. You'll get there when you get there. You might want to use some judicious decision-making and look, we're just going to be safe. We're going to go spot by spot, little by little. If it's an active shooter situation, you have to bypass every potential threat and get to the shooter right away and run past other situations which you might be able to de-escalate. There's a good case to be made that Michael Byrd made it far worse by just that one thing. And I also consider that lie that he said over the radio, that's post-meditated murder.
Right. And we've talked about this before. It's criminal law 101, mens rea and actus reus, the guilty mind and the guilty act. So he takes time. He doesn't get on the radio right away because he knows he's screwed up, because any reasonable law enforcement officer would know in that instance that they screwed up. I don't know if it was some type of sympathetic fire because he had his finger on the trigger when he shouldn't have, but he's pointing his gun. Nobody's shooting. The only person who shot was him, and he fired one round. And then he flees to a different room, conjures up some story in his head, gets on the radio, and says that he and the other officers with him are the ones who are under fire. A complete fabrication. And a woman died because of it. And anytime we bring up Ashley Babbitt or I see a news article about it, I think of when we testified, because when we were done and we're getting ushered back to the back room, this woman grabbed my arm in tears from where anybody can sit and not participate, but listen and watch
the gallery.
The hearing. The
gallery. She grabbed me too.
And I look, and she's got tears in her eyes, and she said, "Thank you for what you've done." And I just was like, well, I didn't really have any. I just was like, kind of lost for a moment. Didn't really respond. And she said, "I'm Ashley Babbitt's mother. Thank you for what you've done," she said again. And then I just reached over and gave her a hug. And I'm thinking, what I did, you lost a daughter because of corrupt, evil, tyrannical government. What I did is small penance compared to that.
And to this story, some more of the details here. This is a quote from Byrd, Lieutenant Michael Byrd, who I believe was promoted after this to captain. He confessed that he shot Ashley before seeing her hands or assessing her intentions or even identifying her as a female. U.S. House Subcommittee report outlined how the Capitol Police covered up Byrd's identity for 8 months in 2021. They paid him $35,000 to house him at an Admiral suite at the Joint Base Andrews in Maryland, provided him $37,000 in retention bonuses, and gave him a GoFundMe page that got him $164,000. And that was after they tried to use the Police Memorial Fund, which is for downed officers, to pay him out $400,000. And they're like, no, that's for officers that died. You can't just use it as your piggy bank slush fund. And there's also been reporting that Nancy Pelosi, apparently behind closed doors, says like he has to be taken care of. So I don't know what rooms and meetings he was sitting in on where he heard some compromising information, but apparently he did. He got rich off of it, hasn't had any consequences. We'll probably never see any justice when it comes to a criminal justice because it's in Washington, D.C. But at least here, the American taxpayer on the hook for $5 million for a woman, and likely deserves more than what she wound up getting. Let's pivot over to some potential payouts, some potential prices of persecution. And we can go to The Guardian. This is a weird one. The Guardian reports University of Michigan is using undercover investigators to surveil student Gaza protesters.
See, they should have just contacted the Detroit field office of the FBI and said, hey, can you send some CHSs and or undercovers? And then they could have washed their hands of it.
They did, Garrett. Okay.
Well, look at that. I'm not a prophet, Steve.
University of Michigan is using private undercover investigators to surveil pro-Palestinian campus groups, which you and I probably wouldn't get along with very much because they're Marxists, but they are on a public university, which is the University of Michigan campus. They're allowed to say this stuff. These private investigators were trailing them on and off campus, furtively recording them and eavesdropping on their conversations. Undercover investigators appear to work with a Detroit-based company called City Shield Private Security. The surveillance appears to largely be an intimidation tactic. 5 students have been followed, recorded. The undercover investigators have cursed at the students, threatened them, and in one case drove a car at a student who had to jump out of the way. Students say they have frequently identified the undercover investigators. They're basically calling them out because they're not very good at it, and confronted them. In 2 bizarre interactions captured by one student on video, a man who was trailing the student faked a disability. He pretended to be mentally retarded and then noisily accused the student of trying to rob him. Most charges, this stemmed to they actually got criminally charged with trespassing, these minor misdemeanor offenses. They were later dropped. Public spending records from the university's Board of Regents said that the university pays $800,000 between June of 2023 and September 2024 to this particular City Shields company. So I don't know if it's all for the undercover surveillance, but at least they're contracting with them for outside security purposes. They're using taxpayer dollars, $800,000. And I alluded to them working with state authorities and federal authorities. So let me tie it to this one. And you're a Midwest guy. You're going to have to try to pronounce this city's name, which is spelled Y as in Yankee, P-S-I-L-A-N-T-I. Good luck with that one, America.
I don't even know that one, Steve.
So the FBI raids the homes in not going to work here anymore, Ann Arbor and Canton for vandalism investigation. Now, this is a partnership between the state attorney general, her name is Dana Nessel, who we've talked about. She's another communist, and the FBI. FBI agents, in this case, they brought 4 people out of their residence in this weird town spelled with a Y, during one of several search warrants requested by the Michigan Attorney General. A state attorney general asked the feds to execute a search warrant on her behalf. Dana Nessel's office confirmed that it carried out search warrants in Ann Arbor and Canton and said it was related to a vandalism investigation. So this seems like it's very much like we've found our man. Let's go discover a crime with a search warrant on behalf of a vandalism investigation, a misdemeanor. Questions about the judge who signed off on that search warrant, because they need to find fruit of the crime. What like the spray paint or something?
Yeah, some type of stained clothes, and then you're going to match it to the to the paint. But my big question is, why are the feds getting involved with some type of vandalism case? You're gonna what nexus? What federal nexus exists there? Which
It's
to me, on its face, is prima facie evidence of just weaponized government. Is that just where we are now?
that this is absolutely using the law as a sword, not as a shield. It's ironically called City Shield, but absolutely being energetic with your interpretation of the law and saying, like, look, I know this is a weak charge, but they did go afoul of the law, so we're on firm grounds here constitutionally. And now we'll get a search warrant. We'll get into that house, and maybe we'll find drugs or an illegal weapon of some kind or something that we can then charge them to get rid of them. It is show me the man and find me the crime, and all along the lines of federal involvement in this, and away from this particular one. But let's talk about the feds. And I've been cautioning about this. I could see it coming from a million miles away. We've discussed the nihilistic, violent extremist moniker. That's going to be the new agave, anti-government, anti-authority, violent extremist. Now they're going to start with the Marxist lefties because basically all the rioting comes from the Marxist lefties. They have to actually have an example of some sort of violence. I mean, outside of J6, can you name me the violent right-wing mob riot that has ever happened and ended in violence? It doesn't exist. So they're going to get the lefty and then re-characterize it and evolve the term a little bit further. Nihilistic violent extremist is funny because to meet the statute of terrorism, you have to have an ideology and believe in something. And that ideology pushes you to engage in violent action and then through force and trying to inflict fear on people, bring about your preferred outcomes politically that would meet with your ideology. Nihilistic violent extremism means you don't have any ideas.
Yes, that's where I was headed, because this should be a quagmire for the FBI or any law enforcement, because what's the ideology? Nihilists, if you're a fan of Big Lebowski, you know that they believes in nothing's Lebowski.
Mhm.
So how do you?
So let me lay this out, and I don't think I'm stretching or speculating too far. This is a report from last week from the FBI's Portland office, press release. FBI and local partners interrupt IED and mass shooting event. Oh, and it gets better, Garrett, because there's a LGBTQ rainbow kamikaze part of this that's funny. So this teen, whose name isn't revealed because we can't disclose a minor's identity, was arrested on the morning of May 22nd by deputies from Columbia County Sheriff's Office. So local arrest. Detailed and imminent attack plans were reported to the FBI May 19th. So 3 days earlier, he's arrested 3 days later. Immediately, the FBI began working to identify the suspect who was responsible for the threat. The subject was identified the next day. So they got his ID on May 20th. And it was an imminent threat, so they waited 2 days to go arrest him as a juvenile Columbia County resident who shared nihilistic, violent, extremist ideology, which that's an oxymoron.
Yes.
And he had expressed his plans to carry out an attack online. The suspect was placed under some surveillance, so they made sure to get the surveillance stat before they got the arrest, because the FBI's got to get something for its time. The suspect demonstrated, this is per the FBI, the suspect demonstrated the intent and means to carry out their plan. It's a they, them. Which included precise details such as a map of the mall, route the shooter would follow, plan to use an IED to incite panic, and then to shoot the mall patrons and then eventually commit suicide. An alarming number of indicators of a cogent plan to violence were met. At no point in this plan did it seem like the suspect wouldn't follow through on their plans, other than when he didn't, they them didn't follow through on their plans in the 3 days that the imminent threat existed from this person who had an ideology that was having no ideology. Now, sarcasm aside, this is just a way to identify angry virgin teenagers online, characterize them as terrorists, and then have online undercover, confidential human source, or artificial intelligence bot pretend to be a girl who wants to hold their hand and then say, want to go do what terrorism, will put you in prison.
This is bizarre to me, But again, it shouldn't be, because this is what the FBI does. They make a mountain out of a molehill very frequently. I've mentioned it before, this Guardian lead I got one time, which it was this threat to life. You must come in and you must work it immediately. And it was based off some tweet from some crazy kid who was talking about Steakums and tying it to like JFK conspiracy theory and Georgetown University. And he thought it was just a joke. Maybe in poor taste, he was scared shitless when we showed up at his place of work, and was like, I just was joking, I'll never do it again. Nonetheless, my superiors in the FBI and at the AUSA's office wanted to push it. Thankfully, I had other agents with me because I was brand new. So my training officer, or my training agent, and another agent went with me out to Podunk, Kansas to handle this thing. And it was readily apparent, even before we headed out there, that this kid was not able to pull off this attack. There was no evidence truly that existed that there would be an attack. And yet we still were told by the AUSA to threaten the kid that we'd be watching him for 3 years. And if he acted out in any fashion again, that he would be charged for threatening communications. And you see a story like this, and it just tells me again that most people in the FBI don't say no to a bad idea. They propagate the crime instead of saying, hey, maybe intervention is the best thing here. No, handcuffs, stats, those are better.
It's May 22nd, the day of the arrest. The locals, which I'm sure were logged into the FBI Sentinel system as an arrest, they took credit for as well.
Oh, for sure.
That means that it wasn't Christopher Wray, Merrick Garland, Joe Biden's FBI, DOJ, White House. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. The institution is forever. I think we can now say the war is lost.
Mm-hmm.
You can only get rid of it, shatter it to 1,000 pieces, and scatter it to the wind. And if you have not been convinced, let me do a blast from the past as our final story of the day. The price of persecution. Friend of the Suspendables, Suspendable herself, Amy Nelson, who was interviewed by us 2 months ago here on a Saturday show. She kind of did the rundown of what her experience was and then where they stood. And she was really excited. Look, we got a new president coming in. I'm hopeful that there's going to be some resolution to my case, my family's case, my husband's case, as well as taking up some of these weaponization issues like civil asset forfeiture. Well, meet the new
Turns
boss.
out.
Same as the old boss. Amy shared this, and look off screen for a second. She put a nice X thread out, kind of gave a summary of her experience and then what the update's been. So in 2020, Jeff Bezos hired an ex-Department of Justice prosecutor named Patrick Stokes to convince the DOJ, his old working place, to charge her husband, an ex-Amazon employee, with criminally violating his employment terms. Honest use fraud or something like that, right? That was the term. It was basically like, you're a crappy employee, so we can charge you with a federal crime.
Yeah, some archaic statute that hardly ever gets used.
So this guy, former DOJ prosecutor, lobbies the DOJ to bring these charges. Amazon hid Carl, this maybe Amy's husband, hid Carl's employment contract from the DOJ, which showed that he was allowed to collect the money that he was allowed to collect, which means that Amazon lied to the FBI, which is a federal crime, 18 USC 1001. Based on Amazon's ridiculous lie, the DOJ seized $7 million from American businesses and families, including the Nelsons. The DOJ also got 2 men to plead guilty to helping Carl, Amy's husband, violate a fake employment duty, which he didn't. And the DOJ actually had to vacate those pleas because a judge looked at this and said, you can't charge people with a crime they didn't commit. That's violating their rights. That never happens. I've never heard of that happening. So here's the update. It looks like DOJ is finally going to give us back the stuff they took when they raided our home with guns based on Amazon's lies. All right. It's been 5 years, enough time. How do I know this? Well, because Patrick Stokes, the DOJ attorney who originally lobbied the DOJ, just sent Amy and Carl a preservation letter Why? He doesn't work for the DOJ. He works in private practice, and it's kind of tough to see there. But he sent them a letter. He told them that they'd better preserve it so that he can later look at it in a civil lawsuit against Carl. He's filing a lawsuit against a guy who was completely innocent, and he tried to lobby the government to go after. And now he's going to go after them in the civil realm so that he can rack up the lawyer fees and hurt them this way because the government's pissed and they asked Patrick to go back out and do it on their behalf.
Oh, Steve, this we talked about it when we had Amy on. It is perhaps the quintessential example of weaponized government, and it is persisting under the new government that wanted to end weaponization and pointed to all sorts of examples of how bad the FBI was and the DOJ under the last president. Yet here it persists under the current president. Somebody help me make sense of that. You can't. And really, when it comes to DOJ, when it comes to the Nelsons, when it comes to the FBI, let's not forget the two guys on the 7th floor at the top of the org chart used to say things like, you can't fix it. It needs to be disbanded. At a minimum, we need to shatter and scatter the intel branch. We need to send 7,000 employees away from headquarters. But hey, they're there now, so it's all fixed.
We're based
Clearly,
now.
that's not the case.
We're based. We're so back, baby. I want to highlight the one last thing. It might have escaped people's attention. This former DOJ prosecutor, Patrick Stokes, sent a preservation letter to Amy and Carl Nelson, tell them they better hang on to the personal effects that the FBI seized them 5 years ago. How would he have any knowledge that those items were being sent to them?
Bingo.
Because the DOJ still works with Patrick Stokes.
Yep. He would only know because they told him.
All right, I'm fired up, Garrett, but I got a good palate cleanse. It's going to make you smile, me smile, the AMRAD pod audience smile, because it's not all about weaponized, persecuting government. Sometimes cops do the right thing. But give us your final thoughts of the day.
Yeah, if you were with us last time, you know that we headed in a new direction, away from the 9th commandment and away from 1 John. And this one is 100% dialed into what we typically talk about. It'll be no surprise to anybody that we're headed to Romans 13, because the sermon that we're pulling from is called "When Government Rewards Evil and Punishes Good," and the pastor, who's a guy out in LA, actually, his name's John MacArthur. He touches on all sorts of different passages, so we're going to kind of jump around with him to kind of coincide with our clips. And honestly, we didn't pre-plan this, but this piece of it, which is from essentially the intro of his sermon, couldn't be better for today, based on the topics we covered, certainly the last bit with Amy Nelson. But Romans 13, starting in verse 1, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Very important to understand this, because government is supposed to punish the wrongdoer. But that's not really what we're seeing, is it?
I want to see if I can't, from the Word of God, pull together some things that will help you to understand why this is our position. And I want this because I think in the future, for those who are younger than I am, maybe I'll live to see some of it. This resolve to be the church when the government wants to shut you down is going to be tested again. And it's going to be tested at a much more aggressive level. There were many churches that failed this test, and there will be many who will fail the next one. But the true church follows Christ, not the government. Our president said in the last month that the greatest threat to America, he said on one occasion, is systemic racism, which doesn't exist. He said white supremacy, which doesn't exist with any power. And then he said global warming, which doesn't exist either. And if it does, God's in charge of it. In reality, the greatest threat to this nation is the government. The government. And I want to show you how we are to understand that. Turn to Romans 13. Romans 13. Listen carefully to what the Apostle Paul said. Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it doesn't bear the sword for nothing, for it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. The role of the government is to restrain evil. And when it functions to restrain evil, it is fulfilling its God-ordained purpose. Please notice in verses 1 and 2 that government is from God, by God, of God. It is designed as a necessary restraint in a world of sinners. Verses 3 and 4 tell us it is not a threat to those whose behavior is good, but evil. It is those who do evil who should be afraid, not those who do good. In fact, it offers praise to those who do good and brings wrath on those who do evil. And rulers, actually, according to verse 6, are servants of God, devoted to that service. This is God's design for government. The problem is when government ceases to function by God's design, it yields up its authority. The same would be true in a family. God's design is that the father lead the family. When the father leads in a destructive and evil way, he yields up the right to exercise that God-given authority. And by the way, just as a footnote, the man who wrote that, the Apostle Paul, was in violation of the government more often than any other person in the entire New Testament. And when he went to preach the gospel, he was very often thrown in jail, and ultimately he was executed by the government that he refused to obey when it no longer functioned to protect good behavior and punish evil behavior.
I'll let that run a little long today, but I think it's imperative to understanding our perspective and where we come from, especially from someone like the Apostle Paul. I won't add anything else to it because we'll be talking about it probably for at least the next handful of episodes. But just listen, let that marinate in your brain, on your soul, because we are in a time in this nation, probably unlike any other, where government is almost completely flipped its divine ordinance from God to punish evil and reward good. And we see time and time again examples of that we bring here to the American Radicals podcast.
All right. And with that, let's take it over to the palate cleanse. Like I said, government has, by all examples today, been completely out of bounds. It's been using the law as a sword, not a shield. But that isn't always the case, particularly at a local level. I got respect for these officers here. Nice, touching story about some officers taking care of a little boy whose father was lost in the line of duty.
A heartbreaking moment. Police officers and sheriff's deputies stand shoulder to shoulder, showing their support to a 5-year-old boy returning to school for the first time since his father was killed in the line of duty. Little Dakota's father, Rob Pitts, was a 16-year veteran of the Terre Haute, Indiana Police Department. On May 4th, he was killed while investigating a homicide. The day of his funeral, people lined the road. Police from all over were part of the procession and filled an auditorium to remember him. It was a funeral fit for a hero. Officer Pitt's patrol car became a memorial. When it was time to return to school after his dad's funeral, Dakota had a simple request for his mom. I spoke to Dakota's uncle, Greg Pitts. What was Dakota's request?
He asked for a police officer to take him to school.
Dakota got the shock of his life when not one, but 70 police officers lined the walkway to his school to welcome him back. He was wearing his dad's badge. The SWAT team even gave him his own T-shirt.
Even though his father's not physically here, his memory will last, and he just inherited 130 other officers in his life.
Pause it there. It's not all bad, guys. So thank you for joining us today on the American Radicals podcast. Back with you Thursday, 10:30 Eastern time on rumble.com/amradpod. Until then, have a great day.
You've been listening to the voice of the Suspendables on the American Radicals podcast. Follow us on rumble.com/amradpod.